It's this fascinating contradiction, isn't it? The people woven most tightly into our lives, the ones who bring incredible joy, comfort, all that meaning, they can also sometimes be the source of our deepest stress, conflict, even pain.
Yeah.
You see this so starkly in the sources we're diving into today, this incredible contrast.
Mm-hmm.
Like, think about relationships described with phrases like insults, name-calling, and verbal abuse. That classic, maybe dramatic example of George and Martha.
Right, from Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf.
Yeah.
Bit extreme, but it makes the point.
Totally. And then compare that to Angela's story in the material where her connections are all about endless joy, giving both pleasure and support.
It really drives home how our social world isn't just, the backdrop. It's actively shaping our well-being moment to moment, for better and sometimes for worse.
Absolutely. So in this deep dive, we are pulling directly from these academic sources you shared to explore how our relationships add to stress. We're going to unpack how social connections can act as a buffer, a really crucial one, against life's pressures. Or sometimes, unfortunately, amplify them.
Right.
We'll look at how just differences between people, including complex ones like, say, cultural backgrounds, add layers of stress, and then examine how these dynamics play out in our bodies, our behaviors. We'll even touch on the research around potential gender differences and how we respond.
Yes, these excerpts are digging into, the mechanics of conflict, that surprisingly potent link between social ties and actual physical health,
Yeah.
the specific stress of discrimination, and, those nuances in how we cope.
So our mission today really is to give you a direct line to the most important nuggets from this material, like a shortcut to being well-informed on these really fundamental human dynamics.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, the source material really underscores right up front that conflict.
Yeah.
It's just part of the deal. In any sustained relationship anyway.
Sure, because you're just going to have different needs sometimes.
Exactly. Competing needs, interests. It's simply inevitable.
And what's fascinating is how the sources describe the ways people handle that inevitable conflict. One approach they talk about is the high drama approach.
High drama.
Yeah, where the goal, maybe conscious, maybe not, seems to be raising tension, creating distance.
And you might feel like you're winning something in that moment.
Yeah.
Getting your way. But the core takeaway from the material is that approach fundamentally weakens the relationship itself.
Right. It just ramps up stress for everyone over time.
Yeah.
And a significant fuel for this high drama, according to the material, it comes from differences between people. It sort of tackles that old question, opposites attract or birds of a feather flock together.
Uh-huh. And the research discussed here, it definitely leans towards similarity. We tend to be attracted to, and frankly get along better with, people who share similar behaviors, beliefs, attitudes, worldviews. It just gives you that natural baseline.
But the sources are quick to point out it's not all similarity. While some opposite traits can bring balance, extreme differences can become real flashpoints. They use that example, Jeff, the extreme extrovert who lives for parties, and his wife, Susan, the extreme introvert whose perfect night is reading quietly at home. Their really fundamental difference creates this built-in tension because their core needs just diverge so much.
And when those differences create friction, these high-drama relationships often fall back on power and control tactics. These are ways of influencing the other person, basically through punishment or sometimes deception.
Oh, yeah. The material lists some really damaging examples: withholding, bullying, manipulation, intimidation, deception. And the key insight seems to be the impact.
Right.
The sources say explicitly when someone uses these punitive tactics, the recipient doesn't just get annoyed, they experience significant negative affect, like real hurt, anger, sadness, embarrassment, even anxiety or depression.
And then, this often kicks off what's called negative reciprocity. So one person's hostile remark or action, it prompts a negative counter-response, and then another. It's this escalating cycle attack and counterattack that just spirals, increases tension instead of solving anything.
Another pattern the source material really zeroes in on as destructive is the demand-withdraw pattern. Is that the one where...
It's exactly what it sounds like, yeah.
Yeah.
One person makes a demand, brings up a complaint, and the other just pulls away.
Hmm.
Physically or emotionally withdraws instead of engaging.
Mm.
The material breaks this down into a four-step cycle that's really corrosive. First, one partner complains or criticizes.
Okay.
That pushes the other person into defensiveness. Step two,
Right.
from defensiveness, they often move to feeling contempt for the complaining partner. That's three. And finally, step four, they withdraw entirely. Shut down.
And the sources give a specific, pretty vivid name for that fourth step. stonewalling.
Exactly. Somewhere.
It's when the withdrawing person just puts up a wall, blocks communication, cooperation, sometimes as punishment.
Yeah.
Wow. And this pattern, along with the criticism, defensiveness, contempt,
Yeah, those are the ones.
they call them the four horsemen of the apocalypse in marriages. That's pretty heavy. Noting longitudinal studies show these patterns can predict divorce.
It's a sobering finding, yeah. Heavy controlled communication is a hallmark of these high drama patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And the material differentiates between the iron fist and the velvet glove.
Okay, the iron fist. That sounds like the obvious stuff. Name-calling, blaming, threats, sarcasm. The direct sledgehammer.
Exactly. And the velvet glove is more insidious. It's passive, indirect manipulation. Things like using guilt, playing the martyr, whining, denying responsibility, making excuses.
Right.
But the critical takeaway from the source material is that both the iron fist and the velvet glove, equally detrimental to the health of a relationship, neither one fosters genuine connection or resolution.
And then there's game playing. The sources describe that as using deception, hidden agendas to manipulate things. The classic example is that mythic drama triangle.
Right, the persecutor, the victim, the rescuer roles. The material uses Cinderella as a simple prototype. Stepmother, stepsisters as persecutors, Cinderella as victim, Prince as rescuer. You know the drill.
But the sources point out that in real life, this often plays out as triangulation. That's a type of game where two people in a dispute pull in a third person.
Exactly. The example given is Eric and Lori. Lori calls her dad after an argument with Eric, and the dad jumps in as the rescuer.
Okay.
What's particularly stressful and dramatic about this real-life game, according to the sources, is how the roles aren't fixed. They can change abruptly. Eric might suddenly feel like the victim, the dad might get frustrated and become the persecutor. Lori could shift roles too.
Wow. So it just promotes more drama, dishonesty, adds layers of stress instead of fixing the original issue between the two people.
That's it. And a major characteristic defining these problem relationships, the sources say, is blaming and externalizing responsibility.
It's always the other person's fault thing.
Exactly. This creates clear villains, and everyone sees themselves as the innocent victim.
This links directly to attributions, right? Those causal inferences we make about why someone did something.
Yes, attributions. And what the research in the material highlights is that dissatisfied couples, they tend to make internal, stable attributions for their partner's negative behavior. Meaning things like, he is a jerk, or she is a witch.
Mm-hmm.
They see the negative action as coming from a core, permanent flaw in the person.
Okay. But satisfied couples, they do it differently.
Yeah, the sources find they tend to attribute negative behavior to external, unstable factors, like he's just had a bad day, or she must be under a lot of stress. Something temporary, situational, not a fundamental character defect.
And the key insight there is how that attribution style in unhappy relationships creates this dynamic where one person feels completely blameless,
Right.
and the other gets assigned 100% of the responsibility, which makes any kind of collaborative problem solving, well, basically impossible.
Yeah, it shuts it right down.
So that paints a pretty clear picture of the high drama, how it raises tension, creates distance. But the material also offers the alternative, low drama.
Yes, exactly. The low drama approach is focused on the opposite goals: reducing tension and conflict, enabling shared problem solving, and ultimately fostering greater closeness. The sources use that nice garden analogy.
Oh, yeah.
Saying these approaches value and nurture the relationship itself, helping it grow and thrive.
That really flips the script from the conflict as warfare idea. So what are the key elements of this low drama approach described in the sources?
Well, it starts with seeking out and focusing on similarities, finding common ground that minimizes tension and gives you a mutual base to work from when differences do come up.
And then there's empathy, that conscious effort to step into the other person's shoes, try to see the world through their eyes.
Exactly. And the sources mentioned achieving empathy partly through positive reciprocity.
Which is the opposite of the negative kind we talked about.
Right. It's intentionally expressing appreciation for each other's positive qualities and behaviors. It builds up good feelings, goodwill. And the other part is active listening.
Active listening, not just passively hearing.
No, it's described as a truly collaborative process. Giving your full attention to understand the other person's message and then feeding back your understanding to make sure you've actually got it right.
It's like building a loop, the sources say. You paraphrase what you heard, so it sounds like you're feeling frustrated because, and the other person confirms or corrects that's right, or Not quite. What I meant was, and you keep going using non-defensive questions of like, okay, please tell me more so I can better understand.
Yeah. And this reflective listening, the sources say, helps people feel truly seen and heard. It strengthens bonds and even reframes conflicts as maybe challenges you can tackle together.
Makes sense.
A core skill in this low-drama approach is constructive influence. This is about expressing your own needs and interests directly, respectfully, without falling back on those control tactics. The sources call it clean communication, straight talk, or assertiveness.
And the material gives specific dues for this, like describing your feelings using I messages, I feel sad when, instead of the accusatory, you made me cry.
Right, big difference.
Keeping your body language open and receptive is also key. Eye contact, uncrossed arms, maybe leaning in, nodding to show you're engaged.
And a powerful tool presented is using whole messages.
Whole messages.
Yeah. The sources suggest these are most effective because they convey the most information, avoid ambiguity. They have 4 parts. Observations, just the facts, thoughts. I, statements about your understanding or interpretation.
Okay.
Feelings, I, statements identifying your emotions.
Yeah.
And needs, desires, wants. I, statements about what you need or would like.
Can you give the example they used?
Sure. It was something like, I notice you're pretty quiet tonight. That's the observation. I'm thinking you might not be interested in talking to me. That's the thought. And I feel a little hurt and concerned, feeling, I'd really like for us to talk more before bed.
Wow. That is so much clearer and less confrontational than, say, a contaminated message. Like, why are you so quiet? Which the source says is really a disguised judgment or demand. Clean messages are just direct and clear.
Exactly. And when it comes to assertiveness, the sources introduce the idea of the minimally effective response.
Meaning?
Using the least threatening assertive response necessary to achieve your objective, and you adjust it to the context.
Right. So maybe in a workplace, you'd say, I am concerned about what happened, but in an intimate relationship, you might say more directly, I felt hurt by that. Choosing language that fits but still gets the point across assertively.
Yes, and negotiation. The sources emphasize this isn't just for business deals. It's a normal, healthy, periodic part of intimate relationships. It's a process. Both people assert their interests, using that clean communication and active listening, then propose and counterpropose to find a compromise. The material mentions tactics like taking a time out if things get too heated, or just agreeing to disagree on certain points.
They even provide those classic compromise solutions using the Jeff and Susan party example, right? Like, take turns, do both have it all, a trial period, or split the difference. Concrete ways to navigate differences constructively.
Absolutely. And central to this entire low-drama approach, maybe the most important piece, is responsibility.
Taking responsibility for yourself.
For your own thoughts, feelings, and actions. The sources are quite clear. You can't expect your partner to make fundamental personality changes just to solve conflicts. If you're unhappy, you are responsible for the changes you need to make in your own responses or situation.
Being responsible also involves setting limits. Boundaries.
Yes, boundaries are described as your personal space, physical and psychological. Privacy, how you allow yourself to be treated. And protecting those boundaries means being able to say no.
They use that simple example of the persistent salesperson, right? Recommending the broken record technique, calmly repeating, I am not interested, without getting sucked into a debate.
Exactly. And in intimate relationships, the material asserts your right to ask for mistreatment, to stop if you feel you're being treated poorly.
And sometimes, the sources acknowledge this, despite best efforts setting boundaries. The healthiest limit you can set in a toxic or damaging relationship is, well, to exit it.
Right.
In marriage, that means divorce, which the material notes affects, what, up to half of first marriages?
Yeah, it's a significant number. And divorce itself is a major life stressor. The sources examine this through the divorce stress adjustment perspective. They list major stressors that make adjustment harder. Custody battles, ongoing conflict with the ex, financial loss, losing parts of your social network.
But crucially, they also highlight protective factors, things that help people adjust better. Strong individual coping skills, self-efficacy, seeing the divorce as a challenge for growth, maybe. Developing new social networks, having resources like stable employment.
Right. The key takeaway is that adjustment varies wildly. But people generally do better when they adapt actively and when their sense of identity wasn't solely wrapped up in the former marriage. And the material also notes that most of that intense negative feeling associated with divorce tends to subside within about 2 years for most people.
Okay.
Shifting gears just slightly, The source material really expands here to look at the broader impact of our social connections on our health, going beyond just the conflict within a relationship. This connects back to that contrast we started with Angela's supportive network versus George and Martha's toxic strain.
Yes, social support. Defined simply as social interactions that give you access to actual or even just perceived resources from people who care. The sources list different types. Physical or tangible help, like help moving. Informational support, like advice or reminders. And emotional support, being a good listener, offering comfort.
And the research linking social support to better health outcomes, increased longevity. It's incredibly strong, really consistent, going back decades to foundational studies like that one in Alameda County, California.
Wow.
What we learn from these sources is that benefits are linked to receiving actual support, yes, but also just the feeling of having support available that's perceived support. And even just being structurally embedded in a network, like network size, marital status.
It's particularly striking. Perceived support is strongly linked to immune functioning. Citing effects on NK cells, those are natural killer cells, right? Part of the body's rapid defense.
That's right. And the sources say the health benefits of simply having a larger social network actually rival the benefits of tackling major health risks like smoking or high blood pressure. It's quite something. Even having just one confidant seems to make a significant difference.
And marriage specifically is linked to better health, but the sources highlight a really surprising gender difference in the research.
Yeah, this was interesting. Unmarried men, according to one study cited, had a 250% greater risk of mortality than married men.
250%.
Yeah. For unmarried women, that risk was about 50% greater than married women. Still significant, but much less dramatic.
So men seem to get significantly more of a health boost from being married than women do. Why? Did the sources suggest reasons?
They did offer potential reasons found in the research. Things like women often still bear a disproportionate load of housework and childcare, even in marriage, which adds stress. Women are more likely to give than receive informational support within the marriage. And interestingly, studies show women are far less likely than men to rely on their spouse as their only confidant.
Ah, okay. So men might be putting all their support eggs in one basket, so to speak.
And that seems to be one implication, yeah. About 15% of wives versus 40% of husbands in one study relied solely on their spouse.
Interesting. So the material then outlines the two main scientific models proposed to explain how social support impacts health: the stress buffer model and the direct effect model.
Right. The stress buffer model suggests social support acts like a shock absorber. It helps moderate or reduce the negative impact of stress. So its health benefits are most pronounced, or maybe even only kick in, when someone's under significant stress.
Okay, like a rescue mechanism.
Kind of.
Yeah.
While the direct effect model proposes that social support is more like a general health tonic, it has beneficial effects on health and well-being regardless of how stressed someone is. Just a constant positive influence.
And does the evidence favor one?
The sources indicate that research actually supports both models. It might depend on the specific health outcome being measured or the context. Maybe buffer for health under high need, direct effect for general well-being.
And biologically, how do the sources explain this link? What's going on inside?
They point to effects on several systems. The cardiovascular system, things like lower blood pressure, reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, buffering the body's reactivity to stress. The neuroendocrine system, lower levels of stress hormones like cortisol. And the immune system, dampening inflammatory responses, lower levels of inflammatory markers like interleukin-6, basically helping regulate your body's defense and repair systems.
Okay, so on the flip side of social support is social strain.
Exactly. Social strain is defined in the sources as social interactions that actively are a source of stress. They drain resources instead of providing them. These are those relationships marked by high conflict, hostility, negative emotions, or excessive burdens.
Like the high drama relationships we talked about earlier. And the sources state that social strain has direct negative physiological impacts.
Yes, particularly on the cardiovascular system, causing elevated blood pressure and heart rate. And this effect, the research shows, is often amplified by hostile behavior and, interestingly, can be more pronounced and prolonged for wives. The sources suggest wives might function as a kind of barometer, detecting and reacting to marital distress physiologically, more strongly or quickly. A barometer. Immune system dysregulation is also linked in the material to ongoing marital conflict or the burden of chronic stress, like caregiving for a loved one.
Expanding further on how differences create stress, the sources delve into the challenges of adjusting to differences, especially cultural ones. They use that example of Alejandro and Mark discussing the quinceañera ceremony
Right.
to illustrate how deeply ingrained cultural values, beliefs, customs can create these points of misunderstanding or tension.
Yeah, and the material introduces the concept of biculturalism, belonging to both a superculture, the dominant one, and a subculture, the embedded one you grew up in or identify with.
And this creates complex challenges the sources highlight, like balancing loyalty and identity. A person might face judgment from their subculture if they seem too aligned with the superculture, or suspicion from the superculture if they're seen as too identified with their subculture. It sounds like a really delicate tightrope walk.
It can be. The sources list various choices minority group members might make in navigating this bicultural space: assimilation, acculturation, alternation, multiculturalism, fusion, different ways of blending or maintaining identities.
And the material really underscores the importance of ethnic identity itself, defined by shared culture, language, nation. Research presented in the sources shows that for minority group members, having a strong, secure ethnic identity is linked to a whole host of positive outcomes.
Like what?
Higher self-esteem, optimism, a greater sense of mastery over life, more positive attitudes, better coping strategies, improved achievement, overall better adjustment.
That's quite a list. Though, as the sources note, a potential drawback is that focusing heavily on ethnic identity can sometimes inadvertently emphasize the differences between groups.
Right. And speaking of differences and the stress they can create, the sources specifically address racism and discrimination as particularly insidious, damaging stressors.
Yes, racism is defined in the material as beliefs, attitudes, systems, acts that denigrate individuals based on physical characteristics or ethnic group membership. Prejudice is the negative attitudes. Discrimination is the behaviors motivated by prejudice.
And they also talk about perceived racism, the subjective experience of feeling discriminated against, and introduce the concept of microstressors, those subtle, everyday forms of racism.
Exactly. Like being ignored in line, mistaken for a server, followed in a store. Small things that add up. The sources note that much of the U.S. research focuses on African Americans, citing the unique and painful history, forced passage, slavery, segregation, ongoing systemic challenges, which has led to a deeply crystallized form of prejudice that's well documented. But they're clear this doesn't minimize effects on other groups.
And the health effects are substantial. Racism blocks opportunities, educational, economic, creating chronic stress from limited resources. The sources mention research linking racism and other social factors to increased rates of hypertension, high blood pressure in African Americans.
And they emphasize that social factors, not genetics, unlike something like sickle cell anemia, are suspected as the primary driver here for hypertension disparities.
Experiencing racism triggers the body's physiological stress response, activating the HPA axis, the body's core stress system. Over time, this chronic activation contributes to wear and tear, that allostatic load we mentioned.
Right, and it can also lead to health-negative behaviors. The sources cite lab studies showing participants exposed to racist situations immediately exhibit elevated blood pressure and heart rate.
The material outlines specific pathways from perceived discrimination to negative health outcomes, like cardiovascular disease. Pathway 1 is that increased physiological reactivity, higher BP, HR, cortisol, directly contributes to increased allostatic load and, over time, conditions like CVD.
Pathway 2 is that racism-related stress can lead to more health risk behaviors, like smoking, and fewer health beneficial behaviors, like exercising or seeking preventive care.
Okay.
And Pathway 3 highlights the indirect link. Racism and discrimination contribute to generic stressors like financial strain, which then impact health. The sources mention studies showing how generic stress, race-related stress, even gender-related stress, all uniquely contribute to psychological distress, particularly in studies on African American men and women.
There's a really interesting finding cited from an ambulatory blood pressure study where they measured BP throughout the day, right?
You're not just in a clinic, real-world monitoring.
This study, with both Black and white participants, found that perceived discrimination was linked to steeper increases in blood pressure during the night and less of that healthy nighttime dip in heart rate. Both identified as mechanisms contributing to increased cardiovascular disease risk, regardless of the participants' race in this specific finding about perceived discrimination. It also showed greater negative emotional response after stress.
Yeah, that's a powerful finding about the physiological impact of just the perception of unfair treatment. Finally, the sources touch on the research asking if there are gender differences in how we respond to stress,
Right. Basic physiological responses might be similar, but coping behaviors could differ. This leads to Taylor's tend and befriend theory.
which proposes that when faced with a threat, women are maybe more likely to affiliate with others, seek help, rather than just the classic fight or flight.
Yeah. The theory suggests a biobehavioral mechanism involving the hormone oxytocin linked to bonding, caregiving, promoting tending to offspring, and befriending, using social ties for protection. It's framed as adaptive, especially for pregnant women or mothers.
And the sources do present some supporting evidence. Studies show women are more likely to have intimate friendships, cooperate, prioritize social relationships, seek emotional support, often from other women.
However, there's a debate, right? Is this difference primarily biological, that oxytocin link, or more due to socialization, learned behavior?
Exactly. The material notes there's actually limited direct evidence linking oxytocin differences clearly to coping differences. And it points to a meta-analysis, a study of many studies that found gender differences in coping behaviors, while they exist, are generally quite small.
And there's a counterpoint mentioned from other researchers like Geary and Flynn.
Right. They argue that tending and befriending behaviors are also crucial and important for men, citing things like parenting roles, forming social coalitions for protection, or hunting in evolutionary history. And men clearly benefit significantly from social support, as we discussed with the marriage stats.
So the conclusion drawn in the material seems to be, well, that while subtle gender differences in coping might exist, they're likely small. And those underlying mechanisms of tending and befriending are probably important for men too, even if they manifest in different patterns or maybe to a lesser degree on average.
Yeah, it sounds like a more nuanced picture than just a simple male-female split.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, pulling directly from these academic sources. We've seen how relationships can be significant sources of stress, that high drama stuff, or offer crucial support through low drama communication. We've explored how social connections profoundly impact our physical health, how navigating differences and experiencing discrimination as layers of stress, and even looked at the nuances around potential gender differences.
Yes, and the hope really is that understanding these dynamics drawn straight from this material helps you identify the patterns playing out in your own life and relationships more clearly.
Thinking about that stark contrast presented between those high drama patterns creating tension, blame, distance, and the low drama approaches prioritizing empathy, responsibility, clear communication to foster closeness and shared problem solving. Maybe consider the patterns you see playing out around you, or perhaps even ones you sometimes participate in yourself. What small step, maybe drawing on these ideas about responsibility or empathy or clean communication, what small step might shift a dynamic you encounter towards less tension and more closeness?
Right.
What stands out to you most from this deep dive?